Our speaker this evening is Dr. Samantha Duggan, and this is number 3 in a series on emotionally sober parenting. And today's workshop is titled Strengthening Family Ties, Effective Boundary Setting for Parents in Recovery. Samantha is a behavioral psychologist with a background in addiction recovery, working in private practice with parents on family and parenting issues. Also, something you should know that Samantha is a co-founder of something called an organization called Visible Recovery UK, which is an advocate organization for 12-step recovery. And their slogan is anonymous but not invisible, which is a wonderful slogan. And they do a lot of great work in the UK on the public service level. She's also a member of the APPG, that's the All-Party Parliamentary Group for 12-Step Recovery at Westminster. And there's a lot of great work there too. So Samantha, we're so delighted to have you with us, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me back. I'm delighted to be here tonight to speak on this topic on boundary setting in recovery, especially for parents. And anybody who's heard me speak before will know that, yes, I am a psychologist. That is true. But I like to speak really from the perspective of a person in recovery. Some of you already know, but I may as well say again. In fact, since I spoke here last, I just celebrated another sobriety birthday. I got 17 years now in recovery, and that means no alcoholic drinks or any other mind-altering substances. I stay away from those these days and live one day at a time. I thought I'd begin with one of my earliest memories of me plus my children in recovery, because I didn't know when I went to my first 12-step recovery meeting that I was going to be embarking on a journey of healing and self-reflection. I was just looking for some tips to help me with my drinking, really. And whether you're in 12-step recovery or some other form of recovery, I know that if you're here, that you have also embarked on that journey of healing and self-discovery and recovery, however you pursue it. So let me share with you one of my earliest memories of the interaction, me and my children. So my children were 1 and 3 when I got into recovery. And this took place, this little vignette that I'm going to share, took place sometime between 6 and 11 months in recovery. And I know that because I had got into recovery when I was living in Spain with my husband. But when we were about 4 or 5 months in recovery, he moved to London and left me in Spain with the children while he got things set up here himself. And I spent the next 6 months or so on my own with the children in recovery with him visiting. So as they were very little, an evening time bath was a normal part of our routine. And as they were very little, they loved it. And they used to splash like crazy. And our bathroom was fully tiled. Everywhere you looked, it was all shiny, slippery surfaces, slippery when wet, yeah? So this little brother and sister are playing in the bath, having an absolutely great time. And they would ignore my requests to not splash and shriek and shout and have so much fun. I mean, basically, I was asking them to stop having so much fun. At least that's what I thought. And usually they would ignore that, and I would get more and more stressed and more upset. And I came to learn through using the steps to uncover what was going on with me that I was afraid. I was afraid that one of them would slip and fall and crack their heads off the side of the bath or the sink or the bidet or one of those other hard surfaces in the bathroom and split their heads open. And lest that seem insane, one of the girls that I was in school with when we were about 9 years of age, her brother actually did slip and fall and crack his head open and had to be in hospital for a very long time. So I think in part it was coming from that. They also used to get out of the bath when I'd take them out exasperated, and then they learned that if they turned on the bidet taps, they could adjust the tap and spray water all over the bathroom. And this used to freak me out no end. And anyway, long story short, usually bath time would end with me shouting at these tiny little people and then collapsing and dissolving in a puddle of shame about having shouted at them, and sometimes even tears. And then one evening, when I had my back to the wall and I'd kind of literally and metaphorically, my back was to the wall and I just had my head in my hands, and I felt utterly defeated by my inability to make bath time safe and enjoyable for them and for me. And I suddenly noticed there were these two isolation taps at the back of the bidet. One was blue, one was red. I reached over and turned them off, and then that meant that they could no longer get water to splash out of the bidet. And I went to my next recovery meeting and I shared that that was my first real experience of intuitively knowing how to handle a situation which used to baffle me. And I was very elated by that achievement, actually. Though now I look back at it and I think this was the first awareness that I was getting that I hadn't the first clue how to do boundaries with my children. I was a person without boundaries myself at that stage. It was going to be another year or two before I started to conceive of it in that language. But suffice to say that boundaries are essential for healthy relationships and for giving children what they need and meeting our own needs ourselves. And at that time, mine were not in place. Without boundaries, it's very difficult to teach children self-control and responsibility and all of the other functional rather than dysfunctional tools that they're going to need to have healthy, functional relationships themselves, and how to maintain essentially emotional sobriety. Sometimes I tend to use the words self-control rather than emotional sobriety, but it amounts to the same thing. So I look back now and I think, why on earth did I not just lift them out of the bath? But that wasn't behavior that was accessible to me at that time. So that's where I was. I didn't stay there, thankfully, because I was in this recovery journey. But I'm going to show you an outline now for the talk today. So I've used a book called Boundaries with Kids to structure this talk, which I'm going to be interspersing these 10 laws, which are from doctors Henry Cloud and John Townsend, both American psychologists who have written some very popular books on boundaries, first with adults, and then they wrote this book on boundaries with children in response to requests to do so. And I came to these laws relatively late. It's a while ago now since I discovered them, but along the way, I had figured out an awful lot of this stuff with my children myself. So I've interspersed some of the things that I was using at home and using in my parenting classes as well, passing on to other parents. It's really just passing on to other parents what I've found helpful myself. And of course, if it's not helpful to you, recovery principles apply. Take what you like and leave the rest. So hopefully tonight we'll work our way through all of these. They call them laws, and I'll tell the odd story here and there as I do. So the first principle or law is the law of sowing and reaping. Children are always kind of subconsciously asking with their behavior, what happens if I do this? And if you've been to any of my other talks, especially the ones on parenting, so this is my fourth one specifically on parenting, then you will know that I emphasize this idea that whether you realize it or not, your children are always learning. Human beings learn from what's going on in their environment. There's constant feedback happening. What happens if I do this? Does it lead to good outcomes or negative outcomes? And in general, we will orient our behavior away from painful outcomes and towards rewarding outcomes. And as parents, you've got to harness that. You've absolutely got to harness the consequences of your children's behavior, their poor behavior, that is. So as parents in recovery as well, depending on the age our children are when they get into recovery, we can sometimes avoid letting children experience the consequences of their actions. So I speak for myself, I have a tendency or had a tendency to rescue. And I fell back on what the good doctors Cloud and Townsend call relational consequences. So when I shouted at my children in the bath, I was letting their behavior impact my relationship with them. And then, in fact, damaging the relationship by shouting, because those types of consequences where we get angry or we withhold love or we nag, they are some of the least effective consequences, though they are still teaching. What do they teach? Well, they teach that eventually mom will lose it, and I might find that unpleasant, but most children develop what I call parent deafness. So if you shout at children, eventually they will learn to tune you out. You may be hurting them, but they will develop strategies to mitigate against that. I speak from experience as well. You know, my mother used to shout at me in childhood, and by the time I was about 8 or 9, once she'd start to shout, I remember my internal dialogue was something along the lines of, "Oh, there she goes again." You know, I had learned to tune her out. So what happens if I do this is really, really important that we harness those things. And here is my little diagram about what you should do if your children have breached the consequences. So in the outer green circle, we have multiple strategies there. I've talked about these before in other talks. In particular, I've talked a lot about the need for empathy, because sometimes when you meet a child's need to be heard and understood and seen, then sometimes cooperation will follow, particularly if the connection between the parent and child is strong enough based on other interactions, that a little bit of empathy goes a long way in another situation. Empathy before education, I always say. Another disciplined strategy with consequences, you can just let go and ignore, or you can distract. That's obviously the primary way that you would deal with a child, a very young child that's gone beyond a boundary. And, you know, we tend to fall back on that example of the child who touches the plug. You know, you just distract them. You pick up the 9-month-old or the 15-month-old who is wandering towards the sharp or dangerous or electrical object, and you just pick them up and you go, "Oh, look at the nice, exciting toy over here." Though distraction can also mean distracting an older child, say from negative feelings or emotions. So if a child is very upset, after listening to them for a time, you might like to distract them away from their feelings so that they start to learn that feelings, if we don't, you know, pour baby bio onto them, they go. Feelings come, feelings go, feelings come, feelings go. So distraction was something I learned I had to harness actually with my children after empathy. We must meet the need as well. So we have to meet our own needs. That's what HALT is about: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. If I'm tired or my child is tired, then I need to rest. And you know, most parents don't need to be told that if a child is needing a nappy change or a rest, then that's obviously where you go. And that shouldn't stop as children get older, being a bit of a detective about our children's needs. This is the first port of call. I'll show you some examples later on of when I used problem solving. But if we go back to the bath example, the natural consequence of splashing in the bath in a way that got water outside of the bath was that I got upset because I didn't realize that that was my boundary. And I could have moved to logical or reality consequences. Now, this was helpful for me. This is not, this is not an empirically validated model. So sometimes natural consequences and logical reality consequences could mean the same thing. So with hindsight, I realized that I could have explained in very simple language to my 3-year-old son that the water had to stay inside the bath. That was effectively my boundary. I wasn't able to express it like that at the time, but water outside the bath triggered my fear that they'd slip on tiles when they got out. Water inside the bath, knock yourselves out, have loads of fun. And as soon as they splashed in a way that set water outside the bath, I ought to have just picked them out of the bath and gone, bath time is over, we'll have another bath tomorrow, and you can have another go at keeping the water inside the bath when we do so. So in a way, that's also a loss of privilege. You could conceive of it like that. But I would say that that's just in the logical reality consequences sphere there. But you get the picture, I hope. And that's how I wish I had handled that situation. But, I didn't. But I learned gradually that that's the way you can handle it. So, as another example, when we turn off the television, children often complain. What happens if you complain? Well, you won't get television later on in the day. So let's say I have to turn it off before dinner and they have 20 minutes before they go to bed. It's like, if you complain when I turn it off now, you won't have your 20 minutes later. That's it. I don't want to listen to 10 minutes of whinging when the TV gets turned off for a meal. So the next law is the law of responsibility. This is a cornerstone of boundaries. This reminds us that our children are responsible for themselves, actually, and that's even at very young ages. And again, this was something that it took me a little while to figure out. I remember hearing a friend, this made me laugh when I heard a friend, his young son, I don't recall exactly how old, something like 6, let's say, he came over and he asked him, Dad, where are my football boots? And this dad said back to him, how would I know where your football boots are? And I laughed at the time and I thought, that's excellent. That's really, really good. I need to do more of that. I was doing some of that. One of my favorite responses to, Mom, where's my, finish the sentence, where's my school bag? Where's my jacket? Where's my football? I used to say, wherever you left it last, and put the problem back on your child. And parents sometimes can get in a tangle. And if you find about being kind and supportive and helpful, and especially those of us who are wired in such a way to really enjoy helping, or as I said before, if we have a sense of guilt about what our children missed out on or lost while we were in active addiction and now we're in recovery, we can sometimes go too far in the other direction out of a sense of guilt to try and make up to them. But, this is real classic. What are we powerless over, and what have we got power over? Ultimately, our children gradually will reach a point of hopefully being people fully in control of themselves. And we certainly are people who are meant to be fully in control of ourselves. So from the youngest age, we can help our children understand what is their part in the missing football shoes by requiring them to find their own shoes. Other things as well, little pitfalls for parents. I've noticed, both from my own experience as a parent and also observing my friends with their children and my own private practice. Children are in fact responsible for solving their own problems and dilemmas with their friends. It's of course completely reasonable for us to support them while they do that, but I've noticed that the temptation to step into sibling dilemmas or friendship dilemmas is often intense, and I highly recommend that we don't do that. You will really be making a rod for your own back if you become the arbiter of every single sibling dispute. So here are some real life actual examples of things that I used to teach my children that they were responsible for themselves and their own, well, their own everything, their own actions for sure, but their own feelings and their own attitudes. So I also followed the rule that we probably could only work on one or two things at a time. You know that if you're familiar with the Just for Today card, you'll know that it says about not solving your whole life problem at once. And I really practice that in the family home with my children. Children, small children are, you know, even adults, it's too much for us to work on a gazillion things all at once. So I used to pick whatever I thought was the most pressing and just work on that. So you can see that sign number one, I was a massive fan of signs, both for myself and for the children. Number one, stop, think, which, as you can see, is borrowed from our slogan, think, think, think in 12-step recovery. Will mom be okay with this? So that was one of my attempts to help them understand that there will be consequences for all your behavior. And if you do something that you know I'll have a problem with, well, then, you know, trouble will follow. Or if you don't do something that I've asked you to do, or you don't do something that you're meant to do, well, you know, negative consequences will be following. And sign number two, you can see if you're finished playing with it, put it away. My parents, my mother was very good at teaching this. I definitely learned in childhood that if I was finished with it, I had to put it away. And not every parent teaches this well. I see a lot of parents, and that whole messy bedroom problem is a recurring theme. So I mean, up to a point. So one of my children is naturally tidy, the other one is naturally untidy, but I required them both to learn that if they finish playing with it, they put it away. Right. This one they call the law of power. Now, this is quite an interesting one, I find. There's a tendency, I think, nowadays in the gentle parenting mold to sort of deny the idea that human beings seek power over others. But I have found that they do, and I quite like that Cloud and Townsend face it head on and say, absolutely, we do this. So when infants are born, they have no control over themselves, yeah, and yet they have complete control over their parents. This is the functional situation. The infant cries and the parent responds. That's how it is. Total lack of self-control, complete other control. The journey to maturity and to adulthood sees these shift. So as an adult, you're supposed to move from no control over self to complete self-control, ideally, and to stop controlling other human beings. So children, the journey between parent and child is a gradual transfer of the power that you have over your child. You do everything for them at first. You gradually transfer that more and more to them. But children, I think probably because of those early experiences with, you know, crying and being responded to, children seem to have this innate sense of trying to assert control over other human beings. And I think as well, this is something certainly I found this to be true when I looked at my step one. We tend to think we're all powerful, and we see this in children. We see it in ourselves when we come into recovery. Obviously, I thought I was, you know, I thought I had power over alcohol, and I learned that I didn't. I was completely powerless over alcohol. But as I got deeper into recovery, I discovered that I had this illusion that I could assert power over other people. But the fact of the matter is I can't. I'm completely powerless over people, places, and things. So you want to gradually help a child gain more and more mastery over themselves, gently, but nevertheless firmly dealing with their idea of being, you know, a superhero, and that they can do it all. One of the ways in which we can fail to break down this sense of the all-powerful child is by actually letting our children control us. So that was something that I had to unhook from as well. It was initially in my parenting journey very hard for me to unhook from having my feelings be controlled by my children's feelings. So if they got upset or cross, I would usually swiftly follow, and I had to work really hard on getting a handle on that. So you need to well, it's all part of taking control of the choices and consequences, or the consequences for choices in your child's environment. So while it can be appropriate at times to actively control a young child, that picking them up and moving them example, you can be honest about the fact that you can't make them do anything, because if you ever tried to make a child eat, you'll know that it's you can't make another human being eat without going into extremely unpleasant, coercive, aggressive behavior, but you can, as I say, change the consequences in the environment so that they learn how to make better choices for themselves. Now, I put this up at the minute. I'm in the process of finalizing the manuscript for my first book, which will be coming out in late January, early February or so. And then this is part of what's going to be coming in another book that I'm hoping to get published next year. This was one of the most controversial blogs I ever published back in the days when I used to blog about what I was doing with my children online. And obviously it's too long for people to read all there, but I suppose you could blow it up and look at it afterwards. Let me just briefly explain. So my daughter came out of her first judo lesson being really rude and cranky, and I undertook some detective work. I went inside, I checked in with myself, and I decided that the best thing to do was for her to have a serious consequence and miss the next judo class. And I told her this and we outlined it, and she was very little. She was only about 6 years of age. And lots of parents felt that I was being too harsh, especially as I tell the story here. She came and apologized, and it appeared to be a really sincere and heartfelt apology that she made to me as well. And afterwards, when parents were contacting me through my website and saying, shouldn't you have dropped it? Shouldn't you have relented? Shouldn't you have shown mercy and, forgiveness? Or, well, I did forgive her, but shouldn't you have let her go to her judo lesson nevertheless? I just thought, well, no, that wasn't, when I checked in with myself, that wasn't what I thought I ought to do. Not least because if I'd done so, my daughter would have learned that she had power over the consequences rather than me. So sticking with your consequences in the face of a child's upset is really important, but also in the face of a child's contrition. I'm not saying you've got to not relent in the face of contrition 100% of the time. I'm just saying that if a child, let me put it this way, a child is quite capable of learning that if they cut to sorry and they get to avoid the consequence, then that is what they will do. And ultimately, you won't be teaching them what you're hoping for them to learn. Okay. The law of respect. We share the world with other people. We tend to want things our own way. Again, if you're in 12-step recovery, you will hopefully have used the steps to discover that it tends to be when things don't go our way that we get upset. And this is a tendency that we have to work to counteract, even when we're adults. And certainly when we're little, when children are little, we absolutely want things our own way. But we are not the only ones in the world that matter, and other people matter too. And one of the most important ways that I taught this to my children was, in fact, taking the time to go to recovery meetings. when they were really little, and they were very little when I first came in, it was easy because they'd be asleep and in bed, and I could go to a recovery meeting. My husband would stay at home with them, and then we'd reverse it the next night. I'd stay at home with them while they were asleep, and he'd go to a recovery meeting. And as they got older, and my daughter in particular would start to express her dismay at the fact that I was leaving, I was able to explain in child appropriate language that I matter too, that my meetings are important. I used to use the language of, I need them to stay sane. If I don't go to the meetings, I start to feel a bit insane. So I go to meetings because I'm allergic to alcohol, and also I can be a little bit insane without them. So this is really, really, really important. And there are so many ways. I mean, we could speak for a long time, could we not, about all the ways that children can be disrespectful. And again, this is one of the things that is a real difference between how I speak about relationships between parents and child and that gentle parenting approach, which I had initially leaned towards and then had found I had to move away from. There's a real anathema to using the word respect or wanting respect from children, I find, in that attachment or gentle parenting focus. But I found that the truth of the matter was that I desired it for me. I desired it for my children to speak to other people, not just me, with respect, and also to each other. So I think this one here, yeah, let me have a look. This is an example. So on the first circle diagram, you'll have seen there was also problem solving being a way to handle disciplinary issues and consequences for bad behavior. So this was a collaborative problem solving approach with my daughter, who had developed the poor habit of swiftly starting to call people names whenever she was unhappy with them. So there, numbers 11 through 18, you'll see, like, I'll translate the child spellings. So we've got bum bum, wee, and poo poo, and then stupid and idiot. So anytime anybody did anything she didn't like, she would call people names. So I sat down and explained to her that this isn't okay. When people don't do what we like, we don't use bad words and insult them. So we brainstormed through 1 to 8 together, and then you'll see she took the pen for 9 and 10. So use her brain to remember to not use bad words. Walk away if she's cross with somebody who's been naughty. Pray and ask for help to use kind words. Now you'll see that tick and then the X. So I wrote down, and sometimes, you know, there was definitely a little bit of I knew what I was doing. And this is our great advantage when we're working with our children towards discipline, is like, we are adults. And so, you know, we can think ahead in ways that they can't necessarily. So I ticked this option knowing she'd probably object to it. And I was actually okay with that as well. So the suggestion is take away a toy when she uses a bad word. She vetoed that. I was happy to let her veto it because I was actually going to work towards using the other strategies to see could she learn it. Give me a star for every day with no bad words, 7 stars, and she gets something nice. So you'll see her 7 stickers at the bottom there. And I mean, there's a whole literature around whether or not you should use rewards to teach children. My take on it is that rewards can work, but you don't reward children for behavior they ought to be engaging in. So this was something that we used only while she's learning the new behavior. So to not use bad words in this case. Put Nia on a chair if she says a bad word. She was willing to accept that, and put her in her bedroom for 10 minutes. She didn't like that. And then in order to assert herself, you can see she wanted to add no treat for saying a bad word. And she vetoed me shouting at her when she uses a bad word. So that's what collaborative problem solving mixed with harnessing the consequences in the environment. And, you know, I'm pleased to report that she did in fact learn to not call people names whenever she was displeased with them. Here again is, so this was a less successful attempt to use a collaborative problem-solving reward type thing, you can see here that this chart got swiftly abandoned because, oh, well, she gave me lots of bad marks, as you can see, and she was very happy with herself. So one of the things I always say with parents is don't overuse these things. And if it's clear that the strategy is not working with a child, then you're going to have to look for something else, because mostly these kinds of strategies, we were able to find things that worked to eliminate behavior, but also harness and improve cooperation. So, don't worry if it's not working this moment. Maybe it'll work next week. So this was one I axed. So I thought I'd show you that one as well to show that it doesn't always go according to plan. Right. The law of motivation. When I was little, there was an awful lot of because I said so. And I found that I wasn't particularly comfortable with because I said so. And many of my clients were not happy with the idea that you should do something simply because your mom or dad has told you to do it. As my parenting journey went on, I realized that this was something that I came to call maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater, and that actually doing something simply because your mom or your dad told you to wasn't such a bad thing after all. I adjusted the language and I call it because it's the right thing to do. But in many ways, that's like a third stage of attaining the right motives for things. So if I translate this into the reasons why we start on our journey of recovery, sometimes when people come into the rooms of recovery, you'll hear people say that they haven't come actually to stop drinking. They've come to appease a complaining spouse. Or I've heard people say many times that they only came to recovery because of, the attractive men or women in the room. Or people joke and say they came for the biscuits or the tea or whatever, So they are lesser motives, obviously, than coming because you love recovery and you now want to give back and practice step 12 by going to a recovery meeting, which of course will benefit you, but it's also that other focused motive that the mature human being operates from. Children, of course, don't get there immediately or out of the starting posts. They have to go through the earlier stages. So earlier stages of motivation include doing things because of fear of consequences. Now, in the past, the fear of consequences discipline approach was overused. Wait till your dad gets home. It's okay once or twice, but to use it so that the child is frightened of the father is obviously a disaster for both the child and the father. So nevertheless, it is an earlier stage of our motivations. And as I've been saying in the previous laws, it needs to be harnessed. So that'll do, your children will first not do things because they're afraid of the negative consequence. And later they will learn to do it because they're learning right and wrong. So as they get older, you can start to explain more about right and wrong. That'd be another little word of caution. I sometimes see with clients that parents try to explain right and wrong much too early, and they get themselves delivering like lectures every time a child does some minor infraction. And really at that stage, you just need to harness the consequences and ditch the lectures. As they get older, you can, of course, must, not just can, of course, must explain the difference between right and wrong. And I know that's not very popular language nowadays. People tend to prefer harmful to self and others. But I would offer the idea that harmful to self and others, yes, it is better than right and wrong, but it's the later stage. And to skip to harmful to self and others before going through the earlier stage won't necessarily lead to as successful an outcome as if you go through the stages. It's back to this idea maybe I've not mentioned it here before, but you have to teach addition and subtraction before you teach multiplication and division, before eventually moving on to, algebra and calculus. So harness your child's dislike of painful consequences and outcomes, then start to teach about right and wrong, and then add in, how does that make you feel when people treat you like that? And how do you think it felt when you spoke to your sister or brother like that? Or explaining to your child, it upsets me when I see the two of you behaving like that, So these are stages, and I don't recommend that you skip them and cut right to the end. So reminding ourselves of this, I'm going to show you this one. So this was my attempt to harness the fear of consequences, right? So that first stage of development. Now, I had already, if I go back here, I had already explained and asked for cooperation and said, so emotional honesty, that refers to saying things like, I don't like it when you pester me. I even started to use language like pestering is aggressive. So my daughter's very persistent. If you were at the talk on spirited children and temperament, then some children can like really wear you down. So my daughter has the temperament where if she decides she wants something, she is going to ask over and over and over again. So we'd, moved up through the, we were really in the kind of relational consequences, because she wasn't paying any attention to anything that I'd used in the outer green circle. So I knew I now had to move into the inner circles. So I'd tried everything that I could think of. And so I thought, I'm really going to have to do this. And I decided that as the pestering was often for more. Can I have another ice cream? Can I have another ride on the little thing that, those little cars that they have outside the supermarkets in the UK? I don't know if they have them in other countries as well, but, I'd be happy with you having a go on the ride outside the supermarket sometimes, but I don't want to have to do it every time. And I don't want to have 2 or 3 goes on the ride. Anyway, so it was usually about wanting more. So I decided I was going to have to harness the consequences. So you can see, if my daughter asked, can I have something? I would answer with, that's meant to be a no, right? So nah. Because she didn't respond terribly well to no, I figured out these other ways of answering. And I would say things like, I'll think about it, or maybe later, which sometimes were an attempt to not give her a clear no and have her kick off into a tantrum. But sometimes they were also an honest response, because she would ask for something and I really wasn't sure if she could have it or not. And then I would need time to think about whether or not that was okay. So that would be more like, please, can I go to a friend's later this evening? Probably wasn't that, because she was younger than that when I was doing this. So if she then pestered and went to, oh, please, can I call that pester number 1. And then there was absolutely no way you could have a go. So that automatically changed my response to no. And then if she pestered again, the consequence was that she had to sit down immediately and write a gratitude list of everything that she already had. Yeah. And my logic was, in many ways, I considered this to be a logical consequence, right? So logical consequences mean consequences that are related to the infraction. So in my mind, it's more logical for her, when she wants more, to have to do something that focuses her mind on everything she already has. So I'm trying to teach gratitude instead of her entitlement to more. Some parents, when they come to me, they've been overusing taking away screen time privileges, for example. So they're in here at loss of privilege. And I try to pull them back out to the logical or reality consequence of, well, if you're wanting more, how about you write about what you've already got? So that was how that one worked. Relatedly, the law of envy we all learn, or hopefully we all learn when we get into recovery, that we're happier when we're grateful. Yeah. Um, there's not a person on the planet who doesn't have envy. Some people are more prone to it than others. If you are prone to it, then you particularly need some of these little strategies that we have in recovery for learning how to be a less envious and more grateful person. But I absolutely love this picture, by the way, because I think it's obviously it's been staged, but I think that it shows how this is present from birth. I used to joke with my children about how the most interesting toy is the toy that the other child has. And by the time they were quite young, I had helped them learn to identify that desire in them to want more than they've got, to not be satisfied with what they've got, to feel entitled, to be in control of other people. Children, I find, also get very put out. They feel entitled to not have to work hard. They feel entitled to get everything they want, to not suffer ever from what they perceive as lack. They're very unhappy about having to adopt boundaries. They feel entitled to what other people have. So, if you've got more than one child, you'll know very much about that. If you touch it, then I want it. Um, one of the things that I found helpful in this regard was helping my children understand. It turned out they had a faulty idea, just like I uncovered that I had lots of faulty ideas when I got into recovery and I had to uncover them and let go of them. My children had the faulty idea that adults got everything they wanted and they felt life was very unfair because they didn't get whatever they wanted. But they started to accept it better when they understood that I don't get everything I want. And at the time I used to say, even the Queen doesn't get everything she wants, because my children are growing up in England. Sometimes the Queen has to go and shake hands with somebody when she'd really rather stay at home and watch television. And that's just life. So these were some of the ways in which we taught these things here. And here you see, this is it's 2013. So that means my daughter was 7. Yeah, she was 7 years of age, and this was not her first gratitude list. Yeah, I recommend you don't need to correct spelling on gratitude lists, but this is what's possible, I suppose, when you teach it. Yeah, teach it from an early age. So, and I used to find it quite satisfying as well to it helped reduce my feeling of helplessness and hopelessness and powerlessness and that feeling of wanting to give up that can come if you don't know what to do when your children are doing things that you'd rather they didn't do, but you don't know how to handle it. So I found that these, writing lines, and let me explain as well. The first time I used the writing lines example, it was with my son when it just popped into my head. So I suppose you might call it that it was another one of those intuitively knowing how to handle situations which used to baffle you. So I got him to sit down and write a line about what was it? It was something like, I will accept my correction willingly, or something like that. So I was focused on his attitude, and perhaps some people could say that that's a secondary, you shouldn't worry about that, let him do it with a grumpy attitude. And there are times when I definitely let my children accept their discipline in a huff, and then there were other times when I was motivated to try and help them learn that better attitude. So he sat down and he wrote the lines, and as I thought about it afterwards, I thought it actually conforms to principles of sound psychology, and because in CBT we learn to harness what we think and change what we think. So I found that by having my kids write lines, I didn't do it a gazillion times, but I did it enough times for them to learn good stuff. Um, and I found that what you're doing is you're reinforcing that idea in their brains instead of letting them flounder in the idea that they are entitled to everything they want. Okay, so the law of proactivity. We all know when we get into recovery that we're much better at reacting than responding. So this is basically a law about that. It's much better to come from proactive boundaries rather than reactive boundaries. Reactive boundaries just identify the fact that there is a problem. So, you know, if a teen is throwing a tantrum, you know that there's a problem. In fact, I would say there are two problems. Number one, it's whatever the teen is identifying as the problem. There's also the fact that the teenager doesn't know how to do something alternative to a tantrum at this stage, because reactive boundaries don't solve the problem. You need proactive boundaries in order to solve the problem. In order to make sure you don't have teenagers who still throw tantrums, you need to start teaching alternatives to that way earlier. So here is my sign that used to go up, that went up, about how I would teach my children to not throw tantrums. So obviously there's say it with words, but often that's beyond what people are capable of when they've hit the tantrum phase, because they're now not at all in that frontal cortex. So if they were out of that, it was acceptable in our house to hit cushions or a doll. That was a hard one for me to wonder. It's like, oh, because a doll is kind of like a human and it felt a bit uncomfortable. In fact, they never really did that. It was an option that they had, but they never really had that. You were allowed to do something to calm down. They had these egg chairs, which I bought from IKEA, and you could go and sit in your egg chair, which had a hood that came over the front to completely cut you off from the world, and it swung because repetitive rocking motions are soothing. And they could write a letter or do a picture of how angry they feel or growl. And in fact, my son became a real growler for years. And I was a big fan of doing pictures to show how angry I was. And my daughter became somebody who loved to write a letter. Related to that, I want to talk about the law of, this is a weird title, the law of exposure. Honesty is the best policy. So when I was cross, I find that I got myself into a lot of parental holes when I tried to pretend that I was more patient than I really was. And so when I was angry, instead of shouting at my children, so I didn't like shouting at them, they didn't like being shouted at. I felt such shame because I'd been shouted at in my childhood and I really didn't want to do that. So the goal with this was to immediately make progress, though not necessarily, I couldn't wave a magic wand and suddenly have infinite patience. I don't believe there's any such thing actually as an infinitely patient parent. Children sometimes do really annoying things. So if I was angry, this is an example of doing a picture of how angry I was. And after doing that for many years, here's another example. So here's the letter. So I'm absolutely furious. So lots of capital letters and underlines and words like hate. And, so I would come in out of the situation and write this letter. And I let my children see me doing it. It's painful to do these things, but we grow through pain. So if I just mention these last two, the law of evaluation, it was really important to distinguish between harm and hurt. So when I shouted at my children, that was causing harm. It was really important that I stopped doing that and moved to other strategies like these things when I was angry in order that I wouldn't harm my children. But on the other hand, it's okay to cause hurt. And I know this is a strange concept, but we do all know this. We will take our children to the dentist where they may get hurt, or we will take them and pour TCP onto their wound in order to get the grit and the dirt out. And that hurts them, but we know that's really important. So pain isn't necessarily a bad thing. You need to learn how to evaluate the pain and establish if it's the pain of growth or whether it's pain of an unmet need. If it's pain of an unmet need, you meet the need. So here is a situation where my daughter was in great pain because I wouldn't allow her use her savings to buy the ballet tutu and point shoes that she wanted to buy. And she was absolutely furious. And because of the journey we'd been on together, learning how to express all of this discomfort and uncomfortable anger for years, she wrote me this note when she was about 8 when she wrote this. And I absolutely, I love the bit where she tells me she's going to come out and have her dinner, but she doesn't intend to talk very much, so I absolutely shouldn't push it. So that's what's possible, I found, if you introduce children to these strategies early on. Okay, the final law I want to talk about is the law of activity. We all know that sometimes it's easier to just sit on the couch and watch Netflix instead of to go to the meeting and do the right thing. But it's really, really important that we do foster a sense of wanting to do the right thing. So this is what Cloud and Townsend called activity, and the corollary to that is passivity. So it's easier for children to do the wrong thing than the right thing sometimes. So I remember observing sometimes my children would arrive in people's houses, and older children, or sometimes even the children that come to visit, wouldn't say hello. And sometimes my children didn't want to say hello to the people who'd come to visit, but I used to make them do so, because ultimately it's not good to develop a child with passivity, or a human being, a person. Our own passivity needs to be harnessed and gradually let go of as well. So in one of the biggest places we see this is with the computer games. And so I remember some children that my kids knew who were clearly on the shyer end of the spectrum and found social interactions harder. Their parents would allow them to use the phones and the screens as a way to avoid the much more difficult social interaction. But I think that is really not a great plan, because for a child that finds it hard to do so, the more you allow them to not do so, then they're not picking up the skills. Anyway, we came up during the holidays. I was going to tell the story here, but well, just about enough time. When I finally bought an Xbox, earlier than I'd have liked to, but later than my children wanted, my first day when we set it up, I decided that I'd let them go on it as much as they wanted. And that resulted in 9 hours of Xbox watching. And that was my first clue that, my children, if I let them, would just mong out on the sofa for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and watch and play Xbox. So every school holiday, we would write a list. So the idea was, you've got privileges, but you've also got responsibilities. And your responsibility are to do the actions that are important for your life. So we used to require them to do some chores. We used to require them to do some reading of real stuff. We used to require them to make sure their bed was made and tidy their room and play with each other and all of these things. And after that, then you could go on your Xbox. And the last thing I want to share is, this is a letter from my son. He's about 9 when he wrote this. Well, it was an essay for school. And you can see, so this is, he says his Xbox is quite new, but it's this bit in that I've highlighted that I want to draw your time to. If you have free time all day for your whole life, you get spoiled and you get used to always having free time. And in the end, you get bored. I think people need time to work and time to play. And that is what the law of activity is about. Don't feel bad about requiring your children to meet their own responsibilities using their own internal energy. It will pay off in the end, even though it might be hard work at the time. So it's a real labor of love doing boundaries with children. There are some of the stories and the things that I've learned from doing it with my own, and it's time now to take any questions that people have.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for another outstanding presentation